On Michelson Alexander Explains thus far, we've mostly discussed the Paralympics and the Olympics. But with Victoria and New South Wales in ongoing hard lockdowns, it's time to change the tune. The pandemic is once again the force that is driving most of the stories on the front pages, and there's plenty at stake for politicians, businesses, and celebrities alike. This week, Michelson Alexander's senior associates, James Fitzpatrick and Shannon Gill, join me to dissect the major stories. What can businesses do to encourage their employees and customers to receive a COVID-19 vaccine? Why did the public take exception to Scott Morrison's Father's Day trip to Sydney to see his family? And if they had their moments in the sun again, what would Nadia, Bartel and Sebastian do differently? So as Victorians, we all know and understand the importance of a vaccination. And as a trio, we're incredibly lucky to work in a small team where every one of our members has already had a jab. But for a lot of businesses and organisations, it's not that straightforward. So Shannon, if you're approaching the task of asking a large staff of employees to get a vaccine, how would you approach it?
Jack, it's not a simple issue. We know across the board that vaccination is our way out. So I think all businesses out there, whether they are directly affected by lockdowns and so forth, know that vaccinations are likely the way out. But let's just, for the moment, let's just park the potential legal aspect to making vaccinations mandatory. So let's park that aside and let's say we are a business that wants to encourage our people to get a vaccination. So I think that the experience of the last 18 months, and particularly for those in Victoria, but really for those in New South Wales at the moment as well, and others have experienced it in harsh forms, is that we have been told what we can and can't do for a long time now. And wherever you stand on the issue, I think for a business to get that last message across to encourage its people to vaccinate, there needs to be a sense of a light at the end of the tunnel, something to show where we will get to if you vaccinate. So not about you must vaccinate, but about this is what the world looks like if you vaccinate. We all want to get back to normal. This is what will happen if we vaccinate. So it's not a hectoring of them or not a pressuring them to do it, but it's a friendly and it's a friendly showcase of what the world will look like if you join in on our journey. So I think we've seen some really good examples of it, and particularly the Qantas ad about showing travel that, you know, we've forgotten about this in a lot of ways, and we will hark back and think, oh, how good was that? So you get that. So if you were a business that wanted your workers to be doing that, you need to show not only in a work sense, but what life looks like beyond that. So you will have holidays back. You will have socializing back. These are the things that will happen. I think we've heard of examples of companies having medical experts speak to groups of employees over Zoom about the general topic of vaccination and taking the questions and demystifying some of the misinformation that might be out there, but not telling them you must get vaccinated. So I think that's probably the way to do it. There's some other elements too. I know, James, you've got some thoughts on this too, in relation to the way that it can be communicated to disarm the people receiving the message as well.
I think you've made a couple of really key points there, Shannon, that businesses need to be really mindful of. And it goes back to some of your strategic communications basics, you know, the Stratcoms 101, where you never want to come across as being heavy-handed or forcing someone into a situation or coming across as telling your stakeholders what they should be doing. It's more about building a communications campaign and communications messaging that matches that helps people come to the decision in their own time and on their own accord, rather than feeling like they're under pressure to make a decision or that you're forcing them to do something. And I think we've seen the consequences of going too heavy-handed, particularly in US politics over the past couple of decades, and how that can actually just back people into a corner and have the opposite result and increase their resolve against the pathway or the line of messaging that you're going towards. So I think businesses need to be really careful about that point when it comes to vaccination messaging, and build awareness about the benefits of having a vaccinated population, and encouraging people to get vaccinated without enforcing it. And I think there's some clever ways you can do that. One of which, outside of your messaging, more from an operations point of view, is just making it really easy for your staff to get vaccinated. And that could be as simple as ensuring that people get paid leave to be able to go and get vaccinated while or during work hours. Or it might be, as you mentioned there, Shannon, bringing in experts to help build awareness and understanding, and acknowledging and being empathetic and compassionate to those staff members who maybe are a little bit unsure. You know, there's nothing wrong with being unsure about something, and about coming to forming your own informed opinion rather than just doing what everyone tells you to do. So I think those are the kind of things that businesses need to be really wary of. And the other thing that I'd suggest considering is whether you use humour in part of your communication material. And I know this is quite a serious topic, so I certainly wouldn't go overboard with using humour. But we've seen, and there's some research to back this up. There's a great piece from Professor Martin Eisen back in 2010 where he shows that using humour in strategic communications campaigns can be really beneficial to building an argument, because it serves as a distraction. As soon as you get a piece of or read or consume a piece of communication that has a little bit of a humour twist to it, it's a distraction from us building that counter argument in your head. So particularly if you're seeing some messaging from government or from other stakeholders whom some people don't always trust, if you start with humour, then people, their barriers, their immediate barriers where they start building a counter argument to what they're about to hear is brought down, and they're a little bit more open then to hearing the message that's about to come through. Obviously not going overboard, and I think the way that Telstra did their vaccination message is a really good example of that, where they started with a little bit of humour at the start about the running joke about 5G, but then they went straight into then the more serious side of it. So that's something that I think, if appropriate for your business, I'd certainly recommend considering that as well.
Obviously, the union movement has quite a few problems with this, particularly around whether a union would represent a worker who was unfairly dismissed because they wouldn't want to receive a COVID vaccine. Now, we're not going to delve into that, but the interesting case study that they've already done is that union members fronted an online forum. There was about 500 people there. They were presented to by 4 medical experts, and around 30% of the people present who had reported hesitancy then changed their mind based on that public forum, which very much took a soft-handed, gentle approach to trying to drive some attitudinal change. So I think that's a real world example of this approach kind of already at play.
There's another element to this too, that what you do with your workers can also affect the way your brand is perceived outside of your discussion with workers, and also your political engagement. So if I look at Qantas, or you look at, for example, the live music industry, and we'll talk a little bit more about them later on, both of Qantas and the live music industry are desperately trying to reopen their industries because they have been decimated. They haven't got anything at the moment. Now, it helps in their political engagement and their representation of the want and the ways to open up if they are actually fronting a proactive campaign and telling in the case of Qantas, telling their workers or asking their workers to get vaccinated, or for the purposes of the live music industry, using their reach and popularity to influence. So I think there's another element there, that what you do can also help you in your engagement to negotiate what happens next.
The one thing that I just finish on, just to build on what you've said there, Shannon, it's a really good reminder to businesses, and we've covered this topic in a few of our recent blogs, about the role that businesses do play in social conversations, and really important social conversations. And we've covered the role previously on the role that businesses play in the growing debate about racism in different industries and whether businesses should be providing leadership on this, and not just looking to our political leaders, but also looking to businesses to provide leadership in this area. And I think this topic of vaccinations is no different. As you've said, Shannon, it's a really important one for businesses to play a role in, because people do look to organisations and brands and leaders of those organisations for what they should be doing. And in fact, there's often a lot more trust in some private sector leaders than there are in public sector leaders sometimes. So I think it's important for businesses to be aware of that and the social currency that they've got, and to use that wisely.
So I'm going to move us forward. The Prime Minister on the weekend for Father's Day flew from Canberra to lockdown Sydney to visit his family, and then didn't post about it. He posted an old photo from some months back on Instagram, and it wasn't until the press got wind of the trip that it was reported in the media. So my question to you, James, to open there is why the public and the press took exception to this particular trip.
To understand why there was a lot of backlash on this trip, and we're seeing similar backlash in past examples, particularly with Scott Morrison, but other leaders as well, is that even if it was technically legal, there are a lot of families right now across Australia who, because of lockdowns, can't see their family members. And so despite the fact that what he did was legal, it's really hard for them to accept that he's allowed to go and do this while they can't see each other. And it's all about putting yourselves in the shoes of those people and trying to understand why they feel the way that they do, and try to empathise with them. And I think Goziel wrote a great op-ed in the Sydney Morning Herald about how if you're not bound by the rules, or if the rules don't negatively affect you, then it's really hard for you to understand them. And I had a personal experience of this, I think, probably a couple of months ago when we were sort of in and out of lockdowns. Personally, I was getting quite frustrated and was privately criticising a lot of businesses who were coming out and really slamming the lockdowns and saying, this is a ridiculous policy. We've got to open up now. I was criticising that and saying, well, hold on. How on earth can you say that when we like the evidence is clear? We've got a lockdown to save lives. Like, how could you argue against that? And what I realised was I was coming from quite a privileged position in that the lockdowns haven't negatively affected my business, or they haven't negatively affected my income. So it's really easy for me to come to that conclusion and support lockdowns. I think the important lesson there is to put yourself in the shoes of the people that are negatively affected by the rules. And if you do, I think you can begin to understand why there is so much backlash about Scott Morrison's trip and his ability to see his family members when so many can't right now.
I think it's a really important thing in a political sense, but also in any sort of comms and strategic comms sense, is when you have your strategic comms team, you actually need your teams to have that rounded background and experience to look at things from other angles and other points of view. We talk about it in a political sense that sometimes it's perceived as being in the bubble, whether it's the Canberra bubble or the Spring Street bubble or whatever. That it's hard to see out of it. That is a perception that has probably grown a little bit. And what I can say, I think in Victoria has grown a little bit amongst people because we have been locked down for so long, that we are not living our normal lives. Even the simple act of getting in the car and driving to work, which we are not doing and which might not register on the excitement levels. They're things that we're not allowed to do right now. So I think in one sense, people are looking at politicians and saying, well, hang on, they're out there doing their job like they always do and we're not. Now, put aside the fact that this would not be a fun job to be doing right now, and the hours that they're working are completely ridiculous compared to probably most. But there is an element of that, and there's a little bit, I think, on a smaller scale in relation to Scott Morrison's situation, is that, for example, Dan Andrews posted a photo of he and his family at the kitchen table on Father's Day, and talking about, great to be with my kids on Father's Day. Now that is going to raise the ire of people who cannot see their father on Father's Day. It is a reminder that we actually, in this situation, we do need to think, and doesn't mean you be ultra careful and do nothing, but you have to be cognizant of that. And it might be that the Dan Andrews post might be about, I am very lucky because I live with my children. I'm thinking of everyone who's not with their fathers today, or something like that. But that's the sort of comms that you just need to think about to ensure that you're actually speaking to everyone.
And just on that point, Shannon, I think this marks a really interesting turning of the tide, which probably particularly interesting for us political and media nuffies. But for a few decades there, we saw pre-COVID, political media reps trying to build this image of our politicians being just your regular people on the street, trying to build this understanding that, you know, they're just like me and you. They have families, you know, they still have family lives. They still operate the same way that we do. They just have this other role. You know, their role as a political leader is just, you know, that's their day job, but they are very similar to everyone else, and try to build that human angle to the leaders that we follow. And I think that worked for a couple of decades. And I think they saw the benefits of that. I think with COVID, we've got a really different situation right now. And that media approach is no longer relevant for the reasons that you've just discussed, Shannon. Because people can't have that family interaction right now, I think broadly what the public are looking for is more like your wartime leaders, your wartime prime ministers, your wartime premiers, which is a very different approach. No longer do people want to see that human side, that sitting around the kitchen table photo that you pulled out there, Shannon. More, they want to see someone taking really decisive leadership, decisive action in the war room every day, in the fight against COVID, in the fight against Delta. And I think that's a really important turning of the tide and shift in the media narrative for our leaders to be aware of while we deal with this COVID situation.
Yeah, and it sounds terrible, but there is almost a want from people to know that the people that are leading us are also feeling the effects, and then they will therefore know what we're going through. So the idea that if Scott Morrison had have tweeted, because of COVID restrictions, I can't see my family on Father's Day, that is sad for him and his family. But I think immediately everyone that's sitting at home will go, we'll empathise with that. We'll understand that because, well, I can't do that. Last year, Dan Andrews said it a lot. He talked about not being able to see his elderly mother. And I haven't seen my elderly mother since this time. That was a line that worked. While I'm not saying it wasn't truthful, it was a line that worked very well in letting people know at home that he is going through something very similar to you.
I think the other way where they've probably done that well over the past year and a half as we've been dealing with COVID is we've seen premiers of New South Wales and Victoria, who are at the sort of forefront of the long outbreaks, in Gladys and Dan, present to media packs every day during the extended lockdowns. And I think that's that's something that I've found has resonated with people that I've spoken to, who've said, look, they're getting up there every day and answering question after question, like really difficult questions too from journalists. And they're fronting up and doing that every day of the week, even on weekends. And I think that's one example where they've probably nailed it in that sense, because they're going out of their way, above and beyond their call of duty, to try and help come to a resolution to some of these issues. And I think that's probably one thing that they have done well.
It's an interesting shifting of the goalposts as well for Dan and Scott Morrison, who have made something of the Daggy Dad shtick. And it's interesting that it came to light for two entirely different reasons. Dan was just, at home. Scott Morrison had a flight that was sanctioned by the ACT's chief health officer. I tried to call him the Cho then. But they've come to the same sort of media attention for different reasons. We're going to talk a little bit about some celebrities. And when it comes to celebrity column inches, they've mostly been taken up in the last 7 days by Guy Sebastian and Nadia Bartel, who both had different mishaps. So we'll start with Guy Sebastian. He initially jumped on the vaccination campaign alongside 200 other musicians. Then he issued an apology for jumping on. And then he issued a clarification on his apology stating that he was double vaccinated and wasn't anti-vax, but didn't believe in telling people what to put in their bodies and believed that vaccination is an individual health choice for everyone. So by wading in, did he just create an enormous hullabaloo for himself that didn't need to happen, Shannon Gill?
Jack, first of all, I'm glad you've given the celebrity life section to me to kick off with. Really enjoy that. Guys made a couple of missteps here. And I think the thing that with Guy Sebastian on this is, first of all, you need to make a considered decision before you put your name to things like this. Now, I would suggest that 95% of the music industry people that put their names to this, there would not have been any downside for it. Their core audience is on board with the message, is on board with the, I suppose, what has become the political element to this. Guy's audience possibly has an element that is not on board with this. Now, his backtrack, even though he's double vaccinated, so he's not essentially anti the message. His problem was he was worried about alienating part of his audience. There was a part of his audience that are not on board with this message. So and he got himself tied in a knot because he tried to make the disclaimer, and James, I know you've got some thoughts on that we'll go to in a second. But then the disclaimer made much more of an issue of it in the first place, and turned the other 95% who then jumped on board saying, "Guy's anti-vax." So I think he's gone in with reasonable intentions, but he has tried to be everything to everyone at this point. And tried to recoup and say, well, I don't want to alienate any part of my audience. Now, if you're going to alienate part of your audience with a particular statement or political view, you need to think that through beforehand. Are you happy with alienating that audience? A lot of people might be happy with that. It might be part of of their brand. Guy's a little bit different from a lot of the people that have jumped on board with this live music industry campaign. He has a TV gig that sort of sits apart from being a live music performer. You know, he's not as dependent on this as the vast majority of the music industry, and his audience is not the same as the vast majority of the live music industry. So it wasn't necessarily a good fit unless he was prepared to alienate that part of his audience.
This is why you do your risk assessment before you do something. Like, you don't do risk assessments after the fact. Like, if you'd done the risk assessment beforehand, as you say, Shannon, there's a clear question that comes up. Am I comfortable going ahead and jumping into this and alienating a few of my stakeholders, but probably getting a lot of fans in the process? Am I comfortable wearing that risk? Probably yes, I would say, if I was advising him.
Yeah.
If I'm not comfortable wearing that risk, that's also totally fine. So just step out of it. Don't do anything. Don't get involved in it. And then you're just staying out of it altogether and you're not offending anyone. You've got to make that call at the start. You can't make halfway through. Well, if you're going to make it halfway through, you're going to end up with a dog's breakfast, which is where we're at today. The one thing that I did like about his apology was, one, going straight to video and getting his side of it out there via social channels rather than relying on the fact that other people would tell his side of the story. So I like that he did that, at least, to explain himself. And one of the bits of it that I think is a good point that goes back to what we were saying at the start of this podcast, when we're talking about what type of messaging or communication structure or strategy you should follow when encouraging others to get vaccinated, is that he picks up on the point of compassion and empathy for those who are unsure or for those who aren't sold on getting vaccinated yet. You know, personally, I want everyone to get vaccinated, and but that is still how I feel, and I'm comfortable in that. But we need to acknowledge that not everyone feels the same way, and so having some compassion and empathy for those who are still unsure is a really important thing for us to take into consideration with how we go forward in helping build a broader vaccinated population. And I think those are the 2 points that he realised, but albeit too late.
I think there's a way he could have done that message. He could have acknowledged the fact that some of my fans are not happy about me lending my name to this campaign. I think he could then explain why he's vaccinated and then encourage others to consider it. And I think that would have been a good response, whereas he got himself, again, tied in a bit of a knot, which then opened him up to the whole other range of people who were never going to buy, who have never had any interest in Guy Sebastian, all of a sudden saw him as someone against vaccination.
We'll finish with Nadia Bartel, who was filmed at an illegal gathering because of Victorian COVID restrictions, allegedly snorting an illicit substance off a now infamous $3 Kmart plate, which is part of the headline that has not been missed by many people. She then turned to fully assisting police and issuing an apology via Instagram. Now, James, in your shoes, or if you were in her shoes and advising her, would you have done anything differently after this unfortunate event?
I actually think she absolutely nailed this one in terms of how she responded and the message, the apology that she put out, again, via Instagram. So, as a crisis comms or a firm that does a lot of work in crisis comms, I've seen a lot of apologies and a lot of them are really bad and do them really poorly. I think for all her faults in this story here, Nadia has actually nailed this one, because the apology itself, and this is a mistake that so many people make, was about the victims, the people that she hurt through her actions, rather than about herself. So many people waste the critical parts of their apology on talking about the context and justification for the scenario and trying to get people to build empathy and compassion for why they made the mistake that they made. No one cares. To be completely honest, no one cares. They care about themselves and how this impacts them. So what you need to show is empathy and understanding for the victims that you've hurt from your actions. And I think Nadia, her apology is simple to the point and focuses on the victims that she's hurt, acknowledging that hurt, and then building, albeit short, a couple of lines to how she's going to work to make sure this doesn't happen again, and apologising for the people that have had to sort of help clean up the mess. In this case, I think particularly calling out the health officers and whatnot who've been drawn into this, dealing with this situation when their time could be best used elsewhere.
And I think a lot of people probably were surprised at how well this was done. There is a cynicism towards what we term as influencers and about where their motivations lie, but she's done this well. I believe she's worked with a crisis comms firm on this, and this is possibly part of the reason why it's come out this way. But the worst part of apologies is when the apology tries to give a thinly veiled excuse, and there would have been ways to do that. We've seen it when different people have broken the rules during lockdown over the last 12 and 18 months. There's often a reference to lockdowns are hard and struggling to deal with things, and that would be an excuse. Now, that could have easily been thrown into the mix, and that immediately would have had the general public saying, well, no, I don't believe that apology because you are a public figure and therefore you believe that you have more rights than me, who I'm sitting at home and doing nothing because I'm obeying the law. A little bit like what we talked about earlier with the Prime Minister and the Premier. There is an element of that if you are someone that's reading that apology, you cannot fault that she has been unequivocal with the way she's apologised. It's not what is termed in the industry a footballer's apology, which is the old I'm sorry if I've offended anyone. It's not that. If you do that apology anymore, it doesn't matter how genuine with the fact that you are sorry if you have offended anyone, it will not play out well.
I think that's also something that's probably been changed by the fact that these apologies now cop an enormous amount of analysis on Twitter and other forums. Like, everyone watches and reads every word and watches and rewatches. So there's a degree of analysis that probably wasn't there 20 years ago. I don't know how much that would have necessarily changed what the right approach is, but it certainly meant if you do muck the apology up, your particular crisis will hang around like a bad smell for an awful lot longer than if you get it right in the first instance. So today's episode is the first that we'll do talking about COVID specifically. As the month rolls on, we'll be rolling in some special guests from across Victoria and Australia to talk about the broader issue of COVID recovery, both the medical challenge and the business challenge that sits in front of us. And we'll be back next month with another episode where we talk about what's at stake in the media for some key figures again. See you then.